So Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is praying. Judas, on the other hand, is leading the mob to arrest him. But have you wondered how many people were there? 20, 30, 50, 100? How many? In this video we will find out. We know the story. We read it in the Bible, we watched the movies, and maybe you already have this mental image of that crowd going with torches and swords to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I don't know about you, but I always envisioned that crowd was about 50 to 100 people which came together, surrounded Jesus and arrested him. But is this the correct number? We will find out. We are going to do a Bible study using the biblical Greek. So, let's begin. Mark and Luke use the generic word ochlos, which simply means a crowd. Unfortunately, it doesn't really help us to define how big or how small that crowd was. Matthew and John, on the other hand, were the eyewitnesses, and they provide a little bit more information on this topic. Matthew adds the word palus, which means big, which means huge, and in verse 55 he uses the plural form of this word, so tois ochlois means the crowds. So let's get a little bit practical. When we think about a group of people like 50 or 60, 100, we don't really describe them as crowds. It is just a crowd. When I think about crowds, I think about the stadiums. I think about the demonstrations when the streets are filled with people. So these are crowds. When Matthew says that it was the ochlos palus, it was a great crowd, he means it was huge. It is still a little bit unclear how big that crowd was. So now let's read what John has to say on this topic. Let's read John 18 verse 3 in English. So Judas, having procured or having taken a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So first John tells us that there were some officers, and the Greek word for officers is hyperitas. As we can see, it means servants, assistants, or simply officers, and that they came from the Pharisees and from the high priests. But also John says that there was one speira, and the speira is translated as a band of soldiers. But how big is that band? So how many soldiers were there? So the word speira means a military unit or a cohort. So let's find out how big that military unit was. Let's look it up. Here we have Bedag open, one of the best Greek lexicons. So speira. First of all, we can see it's a military technical term. This is the Greek word used to translate the Latin cohors. So the background behind this Greek word speira is Latin or Roman word cohors, but also Latin manipulus. So both cohors and manipulus, they are a little bit of different in size, but very similar. So in our literature, probably always cohort, the 10th part of a legion. The speira does normally had 600 men, but the number varies. So now let's open another lexicon. So this is Thayer. So we'll go to B, a military cohort. That is the 10th part of the legion. That is about 600 men. So Polybius here makes a speira equal to a maniple. Okay, again, we read about this in Bedag. On the other hand, the later Greek writings almost uniformly employ speira as the representative of a cohort. So now let's look at the structure of the Roman legion. The Roman legion was divided into 10 cohorts. Each cohort had about 500 to 600 men. Each cohort was divided into 5 groups of 100 called centuries, and each century had a commander called centurion. So in each cohort we had 5 centuries and 5 centurions. Now, The commander of a cohort was called tribune, and sometimes tribunes led two cohorts, as we can see in this example. And the commander of the entire legion was called legate. The Greek equivalents for the Roman centurion and tribune are hekatantarches and heliarchos, which have a similar structure. First of all, it is the word hekaton, which means 100, and the word arches, which means a ruler. So a ruler or a commander of 100, a centurion. And heliarchos has a similar structure. So helia means 1,000, and archos stands for a ruler, so a commander of 1,000. And of course, the Greek word for cohort is speira. Speira, which is the group of 600 people, and heliarchos is the commander of speira, and each speira has 5 centurions. Now, with this in mind, let's go back to the Gospel of John, chapter 18. John chapter 18 verse 12, let's read it in English. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. So again, John repeats that there was some huparitae, the officers of the Jews. And then besides them, he says there was a speira, so this is the cohort of 600 men, and their leading officer, heliarchos. A quick reference from Badag, heliarchos, so a leader of 1,000 soldiers, then also the Roman tribunus militum, or in English military tribune, the commander of a cohort or about 600 men. It also says right here at the bottom that this is the high-ranking military officer. So this explains, these both terms match each other. If it was just a small group of people, like 100 soldiers, we would see a centurion here, right? But we have a heliarchos, a commander of 1,000. So it proves that this group of people is big. It's a full cohort. So the whole group of people here is huge. We have about 600 Romans plus a lot of Jews. Now let's do a quick excursus into the use of the word speira in the New Testament. The word speira appears 7 times in the New Testament, and all of them, without exception, refer to the Romans. So for example, Matthew 27:27, we read, and then soldiers, a Roman term, soldiers of the governor is Pontius Pilate, they took Jesus into Praetorium, another term for the headquarters where soldiers lived. And they gathered the entire speiron, the entire battalion or the entire cohort. So 4 terms, speiron, praetorian, hegemon, and stratiote, all refers to Romans. The same is in Mark 15:16. And then we jump to the book of Acts, chapter 10, verse 1. A man from Caesarea named Cornelius Hekatantarches, a centurion from the cohort called Italian. So here we have it, an Italian cohort, and similar one in chapter 27 verse 1. We see the centurion named Julius of the Speres Sebastes, which is Augustan or imperial cohort. But the key verse for us is Acts 21:31. Let's read it in English. And as they were seeking to kill him, to kill Apostle Paul, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. And so what this verse tells us is that Jerusalem had a Roman cohort, a Roman battalion, and this battalion had a heliarchos. These are Romans. And I just wonder if this is the same tribune and the same cohort which arrested Jesus. So back then they arrested Jesus, and now the same group of people now arresting Apostle Paul. Based on the usage of the word speira in the New Testament, we can be confident that the word speira and the word heliarchos in John 18:12 refer to Romans. And so John tells us that besides the group of Jews who came to arrest Jesus, there were at least 600 Roman soldiers and their commanding officer. Let us summarize everything. Matthew and John were the eyewitnesses, and so Matthew says that the crowd was huge. John is more specific. He tells us that the crowd had at least 600 soldiers and their commander, a tribune, and also it has some Jews. And the Jewish part consisted of the mob, the temple guards, scribes, elders, and the high priest. And the Jewish part of the crowd should at least match the Roman part, or perhaps be even greater. Considering everything, my estimation, and this is still an estimation, that the crowd which came to arrest Jesus was between 600 and 1,000 people, or maybe even more, up to 2,000 people. Wow, who would have thought that that number is so huge? My original estimation of 50 to 100 people was totally wrong. Now it's somewhere between 500 to 1,000 people, 10 times more than my original estimation. And this is why we study the original Greek, so we could extract those details and nuances from the original text. Wow, that's just incredible. So, with this information in mind, the whole story starts making sense. Now, I actually invite you to go back and reread this story to see what kind of discoveries you may find. And when you do, don't hesitate to write them down here in the comment section below. I will be delighted to see what kind of discoveries you made. So if you enjoyed this video and it helped you to learn, please like it, comment below and subscribe to receive more videos like this. And if you are interested in learning the biblical Greek grammar, please consider my video course of the beginning Greek. So now I wish you nothing less than success. Learn Greek, love God. I'll see you in the next video.